This is the Risner Report, a one-hour in-depth interview with former prisoner of war Colonel Robinson Risner. I'm Mike Williams, and with me to interview Colonel Risner is news editor Jay Lewis. Colonel Risner has been a prisoner of war for the past 7.5 years, shot down over North Vietnam in 1965. Colonel Risner, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
The first thing I'd be most interested in is, after being a prisoner for so many years and coming back to the United States, you had to expect some kind of change. But did you expect the kind of reception that you were given when you first stepped off the plane?
No, I did not, and neither did any of the rest of the men who returned. I've been asked what was the thing that required the most adjustment after returning. And the thing that comes most immediately to mind is the kindness and the sincerity of the people who said welcome home, and who are still saying welcome home.
You still have pretty much of a rat race?
Yes, I'm not getting a whole lot of things done. Most of it is answering the telephone and talking to people whom I genuinely like to hear from, but it doesn't provide a whole lot of time to do other things.
What are some of the things that are hardest for you to get used to being back home?
Well, I can't think of anything right off the reel. It doesn't seem to require any effort. In fact, it seems like I only left yesterday most of the time, and I think I can think of no problem areas, really.
Now, when you left, the United States was pretty quiet. There were no organized protests against much of anything. There were no demonstrations. Rioting in the streets hadn't really taken full effect and toll on society. What do you think, after coming back and finding all these things that have gone on since you left, what do you think about the structure of America today?
We knew about the protests, and we knew about the dissenting voices in relation to the Vietnam War. You understand that anything that was unfavorable to our government or our way of life or our society, we got this in a hurry from the Vietnamese. They were interested that we should know all the ills of our society, plus some others that they manufactured, of course. But we got very little, if anything, that would show the favorable aspects of our society. So we knew what had been going on. However, we knew the Vietnamese had been lying to us also. So we took everything with more than a grain of salt. We tried to interpret and read between the lines. And for the most part, we just disbelieved them. But we did know that there had been protest actions and so forth.
Did that tend to demoralize you or any of the other men? Did you tend to think, what's it worth coming home to if all these things are true?
I'm sure that it made things more difficult for most everyone, having some of our statesmen to say things that were more or less agreeable to the Vietnamese. We were fighting them every day, sometimes just for existence. And it didn't help any at all to have someone, even though well-meaning, perhaps knowledgeable, educated, and even loyal to the United States, to make statements to the effect that the Vietnamese were right and we were wrong. This didn't help us at all.
Could you give us some examples of that, what you mean by that?
No, I would not want to call any names. However, we were furnished things from the Senate records, the congressional records, rather, wherein speeches were made, downing the war and so forth. This didn't help at all. And then speeches that were made in public certainly didn't help. The protest actions we understood, and of course this is the Americans' right to protest as long as it's peaceful. We understood that, but it did not prevent us from becoming angry or disgusted or disgruntled with those people who were, in our eyes, prolonging the war, not getting the war over. I know that many of them said, we are trying to end the war. Well, we felt definitely they were doing just the opposite. They buoyed the Vietnamese spirits. And so, in our eyes, our stay there was prolonged by these people.
Did you get the word while you were a prisoner of war of action in the Congress of the United States to cut off funds for the war?
Yes, we got every proposal, every action that was taken against the war, we got it quickly.
President Nixon had at that time, and followed through with it, announced that he absolutely would not negotiate an end to the war or the U.S. involvement until the prisoners of war were released. And yet here's the Senate and the House of Representatives with strong sentiment to go ahead and cut off the aid, or the financial support and also the military support, end our involvement while you're still a prisoner. That had to have some kind of effect on you.
Well, of course, we were behind President Nixon, and we became even more involved as he stood firmer and firmer against the Vietnamese and the fact that they were holding us political hostages. And when he came out and said that he would not withdraw, he would not stop bombing, he would not stop mining the harbors until they released the prisoners, well, you can imagine how it made us feel. We knew then, again, he had just confirmed what we had always known, that we were important, and that we were not going to be left over there, and we were not going to be sold down the river. We weren't coming home on our knees. We were going to come home with our heads in the air, like we went over there.
Do you believe at this time, now that you're home and everything, do you believe at this time that had the United States, through financial cutbacks, ended involvement in Vietnam while you were still there, do you believe you would still be there?
I really don't know. However, I think our chances of getting out would have been much slimmer had there been some other end to the war than there was.
Colonel, we're back now, and many of the same items that are involved in the Vietnamese peace agreement are items that had been agreed to years before, 3 and 4 years before. Substantial changes were made, but most of the basic agreements are the same as had been worked out in Paris. Do you think that the added time we were over there was worth the added concessions we got in that agreement?
Again, you're getting into an area in which I'm really not knowledgeable. Remember, I'm not a politician nor a diplomat. In fact, I've been long gone from the things that you fellows have been talking about for 7.5 years. So I would rather not express an opinion on how we came out of this thing, except to say that I'm satisfied we got the best that was available, and I don't think we could have taken less.
Let me ask you this. I wanted to talk about this later in the program, but you brought up the fact that you're not a diplomat nor a politician, and yet there are already moves to make you one. Do you have any interest? I know State Republican Chairman Clarence Warner has expressed sentiment already that he'd like to get you to run as a Republican candidate for whatever office you'd like. Do you have any political aspirations?
No, I do not. Thank you very much. But I appreciate the offer, and I'm very flattered, but I do not have any political aspirations at this time.
Colonel, now, there is a possibility, and a very strong one right now, that other POWs who have been there 6, 7 years, like yourself, may fall victim to the allure of politics and may decide to actually take some of these state committees up on their offers. Do you think that a man who has been out of touch with society, the American way, for 3, 4, 5 years should become involved in governing his country?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, but I would like to say, in all fairness, to the men with whom I have served in prison, that some of the finest minds that I have ever encountered were there. We had people from all walks of life, so to speak, many professions, and I have the highest respect for their abilities and their capabilities. Not only that, but their motivation. I think that there were men there, if they decide to run for political office, would do a bang-up job and would not have to take backseat to anyone. They would have some coming up to speed to do as far as world events and domestic problems and so forth, but I think they could do that, especially if they surrounded themselves with knowledgeable, capable people.
You mentioned that some of the finest minds you've ever known were there, and yet in the type of demilitarization and de-Americanization that you must have gone through during those 7.5 years, it would have to break you down mentally unless you did something to prevent it. What did the prisoners do overall to keep themselves not only physically but mentally in shape?
Well, when they were alone, which was a lot of the time, they worked mental problems. They went back over their past. They studied languages that they had had in the past. They brought things out of the depths of their minds they didn't know existed, you might say, or had long been forgotten. They worked mathematics. They built buildings. They built new entire businesses, sometimes foreign businesses. Sometimes it would take them 6 months or a year to actually go through a complete setting up and operation of a business. And I don't think all of this is lost. There are people who will now go into business that they had never been acquainted with before, but which they have worked out in detail. And to my satisfaction, it's going to work.
How about you personally? What did you do to while away the hours?
I did some of the same things. I've built houses and gone on trailer trips. And I've seen the United States and other parts of the world. In fact, we, after we were together, covered every state in the Union and every country in the world. And the people who are most knowledgeable would give the preamble or the lecture on this particular country, and then everyone else would chime in with their 2 bits worth until we had a most rounded picture we could get, so that we came out with the people, their habits, their customs, their food, their clothing, their government, and so forth, in most every country in the world.
Colonel, do you think you're a better man for having spent 7.5 years in a communist jail?
If I'm not, I've wasted a lot of time, and I don't believe it's been wasted.
How were you treated overall? I want to talk about you specifically a little bit later, but the prisoners overall, were they generally treated very hostilely by the North Vietnamese?
I think an overall picture up through 1969, you could say that we're treated like animals. And then it varied a bit from that time until we were released. Sometimes they would, between 1970 and the time we were released, they left us relatively alone. But then again, living in 7-foot cells, which we did up until the last 6 months or so of our imprisonment, a part of us, the senior officers, you can call that what you want to, but being locked in 7-foot cells when there are big open-bayed buildings empty, sitting there, but they're keeping you there for punishment. And outside, only an hour and max 2 hours a day, when we could have been out all day. Things like this fall in some category less than humane.
What kind of treatment was there? Some examples prior to the date you mentioned in 1969 and 70.
People lived in solitary confinement. I lived in solitary confinement for something like 54 months. Some were isolated from other prisoners. I was isolated from the area where other Americans were for something like 2 years. People lived in dark rooms. I lived in a dark room, a blackened room for 10 months. People were in stocks for prolonged periods, some much longer than myself. I've been in for, the longest was only 32 days at one time. Handcuffs were used extensively to lock people's hands behind their backs, either while their legs were in stocks or while they had traveling irons on and could move around slowly inside their cell. But they couldn't manipulate their clothes. If they had diarrhea, you can imagine what happened. They could not do the normal things that you need to do with your hands. And when their legs were in stocks and their hands locked behind them, if they wanted to, they would twist your hands and lock the cuffs down good and tight so that the nerves were pressed into the bone. Your arms and hands would swell and turn black. You couldn't lay down, so that fatigue and pain worked on you constantly. The rope trick that everyone talks about is the thing they used most frequently to break you quickly. And it was just bending you like a pretzel, stick your feet in your mouth. And this has been explained many times on television, and I understand it's been demonstrated once to some doubting reporter. And let me say that I believe we had some of the toughest men in the world over there. If they want to break you, in other words, if they want to get something from you, if they know you have it, they'll come close to getting it through sheer pain.
What did they want from you? Our thoughts back here would be that they would want military secrets, and yet more and more it comes out that all they wanted, or most of what they wanted, was propaganda statements. What were you subjected to this type of torture the most for?
Initially, they did want military information, and they would torture immediately to get it. And then after that, they wanted propaganda. They wanted you to sign statements that the war was wrong, or that they were winning, or you just think of it. They wanted you to parrot. In fact, they would dictate what you were to write, or they would want you to make tapes or meet a delegation. And of course, when you met a delegation, you had to say what they told you to say. So you're just their mouthpiece. That's what they wanted. They wanted a free mouthpiece. And they would torture to get it. They would leave you on a stool for days, nights at a time until you fell from fatigue. Make you stand at attention on your knees until pus and blood would run out. Stand in the corner with your arms above your head to reduce you. Oh, many things like that. The whole time, mind you, we had to bow to every Vietnamese we met. This was to humiliate us and force us to submit. And I was told on a number of occasions that we would submit, that that was their intention, that their hatred was so high that it was intolerable that we would not submit after we became prisoners. And so they worked on this angle as well as obtaining propaganda from us.
Well, Colonel, of the anti-war statements that we hear heard from prisoners there, how many of them would you say were sincere?
I don't know of any that were sincere. If there were, I haven't talked to these men. I can't find it in my heart to believe that an American, especially American military man, would join the Vietnamese in their ideas about the war. I can't believe that an American would oppose the American stand. I can't believe they would go against what we were fighting for. I'm not saying this is impossible, but I know of no personally I know of no cases.
As a pilot, what did you think of the pilots who were refusing to fly into Hanoi, for example, for the bombing raid? Some of them made public statements that the military posture in that particular tactical area was wrong, and B, that they just felt the war was wrong, so they wouldn't fly their missions. What did you think when you heard that?
Well, first of all, we didn't believe it. And we believed very little that came from the Vietnamese. And frankly, as a military man, as a career officer, every man has a responsibility to carry out orders. And if he can't do that, then it's his obligation to get out of the service one way or the other. But every American has an obligation to serve his country in the military services as required because we represent the country. If no one fights, who's going to defend the country? So everyone has an equal obligation. And when a man is given an order to carry out, unless he knows it's illegal, I believe he should carry it out.
At a Washington news conference recently, you made it known to reporters and the public generally the fact that you personally did, submit's not the word I'm looking for, but you did go along with the demands of the Vietnamese to say what they wanted you to say. What did you have to go through, or what did you go through before you finally submitted to their demands?
Well, I was tortured. The first time, they wanted me to write a statement of apology to the Vietnamese people that I had violated their airspace and had caused them grave harm, and I don't remember the words, but something to this effect, and just apologize to them. Confess, in other words, that I had been sent by my government, and just a bunch of malarkey. They worked on me all night. I'd been in stocks for 32 days on bread and water, at least part of the time on bread and water, and nothing the rest of the time. And I was cold and miserable for the entire time because I was in there until the 2nd of December with one set of clothes, one blanket, one grass mat on a cement slab with a big open window behind me. And I was cold, and I was weak. And besides, it was rather unusual for me to be locked down so I couldn't move. And after this, they took me out and tortured me all one night. And so I wrote a statement of apology to the Vietnamese people. When they wanted something like that, normally when they would torture and hurt you bad enough, they'd get 2 or 3 things from you if they could, if they were smart. Sometimes they weren't too smart. They wouldn't catch you while you were weak. When you got your guts back, maybe recovered yourself a little bit, then they would have to bend you again.
Now, you're telling us all this, and you didn't want to call any names. There is a certain well-known actress in this country who contends that you're lying. What is your answer to this woman?
Well, I would be wise probably if I didn't answer it at all, because I am in the military. I'm not a politician. But it arouses a great deal of emotion in me to have someone say that after what the men over there have been through. And anybody that says this is not true just must be led astray something fierce. Either that, or they are knowingly aiding and abetting the enemy.
You mentioned that you were tortured all during one night to get this type of statement from you. What kind of tortures, for example, were you forced to go through?
They started before dark by putting some thick pads, about 1-inch pads, over my eyes and binding them until they pressed the pads into my eye sockets, forcing my eyeballs back. And then they started on my wrists, and they bound my wrists as tight as 2 men can bind them. And then barefooted, I was walked for about an hour or 2 around the courtyard, over the nuts that had fallen off the tree, through the drainage ditches and up and down stairs, which I fell up and down most of the time, just to weaken me. And then they put the ropes on me. They started at my wrist and wound my arms, laying on my side, pulling the ropes up, with 2 men pulling on them until blood was squeezed out through the skin between the ropes. When they had wound my arms together behind me, up close enough to my shoulder blades, my right shoulder was pulled out of socket, my left one partially. And perhaps some of my ribs were separated. I had a big knot on my chest for quite a long time, and still some of it left there. And then they worked on my legs in a similar fashion. Then pulled my legs up behind me and put a loop around my throat for my legs. Then I was in agony. And maybe my pain threshold is not as high as some, I'm sure that's true. But it was painful enough that I hollered good and loud most all night.
Let me pause briefly, Jay. I should have done this a long time ago, but I got so interested I almost forgot to even ask questions. But I wanted to pause briefly and remind our listeners that Jay Lewis is with me. Our special guest is Colonel Robinson Risner, a prisoner of war in Vietnam for more than 7.5 years. Jay?
Colonel, maybe you can bring this into perspective. Could you describe for us your mission, not the tactical details, but your mission from the time you took off in your plane that morning till the time you were incarcerated?
Yes, my mission was to find and destroy a SAM site, surface-to-air missile site, which we had pinpointed about 10 miles north of Than Moi, the provincial capital of Than Moi, on Route 1, or Highway 1, which is close to the Vietnamese coastline between Than Moi and Nam Dinh. And our TOT, our time on target, was 9 o'clock. We ran these in two-shift flights to give us a lot of flexibility so we could move around rapidly. One of us carried napalm, the other carried bombs. Of course, both of us carried max load of 20 millimeters. We were running three separate missions, summer missions that morning. As I approached the turning point, which was about 5 miles short of my target, and coming in at a 90-degree angle, I made a left turn, turning up the highway, heading north. And I was flying about 50 feet and about 540 knots. And I had to pull up to go over a little knoll about 100 feet high. As I just pulled up over the top of it, I was getting a tremendous amount of fire, ground fire, from dead ahead, from multiple gun emplacements on both sides of the highway. And they had evidently seen me turn. And they were already firing as I came over the hill. And I took a lot of hits. Some of them must have gone down my intake and hit my engine, because it started exploding and shuddering. And I had fire and smoke in the cockpit immediately and couldn't see either the instruments or outside. So I started to pull up, then jettisoned my load, called I'm hit, and my wingman hollered, "Get out, you're burning all over." And my engine quit almost immediately. And I was turning towards the water, which was only about 3 miles away, hoping to reach there before something happened. The airplane blew up or something. And my control stick came back in my lap, and the aircraft pitched forward, indicating my control system had burned in two. And I was thrown up against the canopy. My wingman had been shouting at me to get out, so I pulled the handles, blew the canopy, and ejected. And I was high enough that my chute opened fine. And then I grabbed my emergency radio to talk to my wingman, because the ground fire was tremendous. And I was trying to holler for him to get out over the water, for I was afraid they were going to shoot him down too. And I only had time enough to cram the radio back into the receptacle before I hit the ground. And I hit on the side of a dike. And in my landing fall, I hadn't had time to deploy my survival kit, which hung in the bends of my leg. And I pulled the ligaments of my right knee on my landing fall. I could see the people running from every direction to be there when I hit. And I hit on a rice paddy, and the rice was about chest high. As I bent over to disentangle myself, I could hear them approaching, and I grabbed my pistol and stood up, pointing in the direction the sounded like they were the closest. As I raised up over the rice heads, I looked right down some guy's gun barrel, and it was just kind of a Mexican standoff for a fraction of a second. I had never intended to be captured, and I was willing to fight it out. But the guy just motioned around me, and I looked, and I had people bearing on me from all directions. And so I dropped my pistol as he indicated and was captured.
Then where did they take you from there? What happened subsequent to that?
They took me to a small hamlet near there. They bound my arms. They stripped me first of all my items except my G-suit, or my flight suit rather, and then bound my arms behind me, took me to a small hamlet, took all my clothes and gave me some peasant's clothes. And there they kept me until nightfall, at which time I started walking. Walked till about 3 in the morning, was picked up by a truck, and we traveled till daylight. And the next night, we rode all night in the truck. And then the next morning, I reached Hanoi at 9 in the morning.
Now, you were picked up and taken to the village. Now, when you got there, what was the reaction of the Vietnamese citizen himself? Were you subjected to humiliation, or did they seem sympathetic, or what was the situation?
Well, you'll recall, this was 1965. And at that time, I guess the government hadn't had an opportunity to really build up a lot of hate for us. And most of the people seemed curious only one person tried to hit me, and I was protected. However, as I left the village that night, the word had gotten around, I guess, and the feeling had built up. As we started to leave the building, the people were waiting on us, and the people that were escorting me, they saw what was happening, and we turned and went back to the hut in which I'd been kept, and we waited for about an hour until the crowd dispersed. Then we left again. And upon 2 occasions while we were marching, the people sidetracked or backtracked and then took me to a different place to wait until people left or dispersed that were waiting on me. But I was not hurt at any time during the journey.
Did the people, they weren't hostile toward you at all at that point? This in 65?
Though there was some hostility, as I said, we had to pull off the road at times and wait or go by a circuitous route because hostile people were waiting. But as far as hostile actions against me, I was protected and I didn't receive any harm at all.
Colonel, there's been a lot said and a lot written and a lot of pamphlets prepared trying to get prisoners psychologically ready to face the real world again. Did you need any help?
No, no, I really didn't. But I must say that I appreciate, and every one of us appreciate a great deal, the thought and effort and the kindness and consideration that went into preparing for our return. And I can understand. We psyched this out to some extent while we're in prison. We felt we would be a pleasant surprise because after such a prolonged period, anything can happen under those harsh conditions. And it's not too far-fetched that we might have come home, some of us, like vegetables. But the other night, my 2 sons, 18 and 16, came in, and I was preparing for bed, and they were kind of laughing. And one asked the other about the POW pamphlet. And I didn't know what they were talking about. And they were talking about what you just mentioned. And one said, hey, have we been talking to him right? And the other one laughed and said, I don't know. You think we've readjusted him okay? And then they just had a ball talking about this, how they're supposed to adjust me, you know. And they thought that was really very funny. But as far as adjustments are concerned, I'm having no adjustment problems. It's just that I don't have half enough time to do what I need to do, that's all.
Now, after the Korean War, prisoners came back essentially vegetables. Now, you kept up with all that activity then, and you helped do your job. What is the difference? Why are the men coming back apparently very well adjusted, very vociferous about everything, and with no major hang-ups, when after Korea and treatment by the communist Chinese, they came back in a terrible state of mental turmoil?
Well, there are many reasons, I'm sure, but of course we had the advantage of both World War II and Korea. Our training has improved. We have the code of conduct as an anchor point, so to speak, a rule of thumb to go by. This is our conduct Bible. Then, the people that were in prison with me in North Vietnam were air crewmen. We had only 3 enlisted men because everything that was shot down practically up until... Now, let me back up a moment and say that was true up until the last go of bombing when the B-52s started working. But up until that time, we only had 3 enlisted men because most everything had been fighters and fighter bombers. In fact, the 3 enlisted men came from the, I think from helicopters, the rescue people. These 3 guys were fairly unique. Well, perhaps not unique at all, but they were also very motivated and dedicated to the service. They fit in perfectly, and it was just surprising to see everyone treated them the same as everyone else, and they treated everyone else the same. In other words, There was no difference among us, and they were great guys. The pilots themselves, as you know, are very highly motivated, dedicated, and most of them, or a great many of them, I don't know what number, are career officers. The education level is high. All of these things combined, I think, and then again, you got air crewmen who are normally in good physical condition. So you take a good physical and mental makeup, take dedication, loyalty, professionalism, experience, background, training, all those things went into the makeup of the men that had been imprisoned in North Vietnam. And so maybe we had some extra ingredients that they did not have in World War II or Korea.
Did you have an extra cohesiveness also, at least a mental cohesiveness among you?
Yes, we certainly did. Unity was something that really gave us daily strength. And the help that we gave each other, you know, even though not every man over there was a Christian, most every man was, there was such a Christian attitude that it's hard to explain. In other words, one helping the other, sacrificing for the other guy, taking it on the chin sometimes to keep another guy out of trouble, knowing you're going to get tortured, but doing it rather than let somebody else take the gaff. There was this help, the support, that when a guy was being tortured, or he'd been in stocks a long time, guys would take great risks to get to him. In other words, get a message to him, whisper through the window, or another way of communications and say, hey, buddy, we know you're in there. Or if there was only time to say 2 or 3 words, just, God bless you. This meant everything. This meant, we know you're there, we're behind you, we're with you, we know what you're going through, and we're praying for you. It just meant a volume. So that the encouragement that people gave each other was vital, and the communications that the Vietnamese tried so hard to destroy or to prevent, and which they were never able to do, was absolutely vital.
What about Robinson Risner now? What are his plans? Does he plan to remain a part of the Air Force? What is he going to do?
Yes, I do plan to remain a part of the Air Force. I feel like I'm part of the Air Force family. The people in the Air Force that I have known, and some of them I've grown to love, they were very close to me. I have friends in the Air Force that are almost as close as brothers. I love the Air Force. It's been good to me. It's been good to my family. It's a great life. I would just be so proud if some of my sons are able to go to the Air Force Academy, because I think they would have a wonderful start in life, a marvelous education, and a career that is second to none. It has all the ingredients that a young man full of go, motivated, full of ideas, it's got everything for him. And not just the Air Force, but the services. I think it's a great place, and they're making it a better place even now. The educational, the education that's available, and the travel and all the other things. In other words, I think quite highly of it. I'm intrigued with it. I really love the Air Force, and my plans for now are to stay in.
You're involved in still in the military, and there's been talk that that you're up for a promotion to brigadier. Does that make you feel good after coming back to know that first of all you'll still be able to fly because they've got the same planes they had when you were captured, and second of all that the prisoners are still regarded as being in the mainstream of the military? Do you look forward to that?
Yes, And we talked about that a lot while we were in prison. And we wondered how our services would accommodate or would help us accommodate to the situation. And let me say, they've done more things for us. They've done better by us than we could have imagined. They've just been great. And I can't imagine any criticisms of the things they've done. They've promoted the guys on time while they were in prison. This has never been done before. Our pay has been upped. They paid us for the time we lost as far as leave. They've just been great. And now they are helping us get the assignments that we want. They're bending over backwards for us. And so, you know, I have nothing but the utmost admiration and respect for everyone from President Nixon on down, because everyone has just really been concerned about us and gone into the most minute detail imaginable to make our homecoming a wonderful one and our continued service productive.
Let me ask you a technical question, Colonel. When you were flying F-105s. Now the Air Force has gone away from some of the later century series planes, and they're going back to, of all things, the 102 for fighters and interceptor missions, things like that. Are you kind of distressed at the lack of progress that's being made, since the Russians now have the backfire bomber and the Foxbat fighter and these things, that we have not progressed any farther than we have?
I think you're pulling my leg because I think we are progressing. You know, we have the A-7, which is a fighter bomber, which was designed to do a job. Now, mind you, I don't know all there is to know about these because I've been gone a while. But the A-7 is, I understand, as the British said, a jolly good weapon. And
They didn't say that about the F-111, unfortunately. But that's another story.
well, you know, I've heard a lot of controversy about the 111. It's had its problems. But I've talked to people who fly it, and they all like it. They all say, well, it's a great aircraft. So, you know, it's according to who you talk to. Now, the F-15 is coming out. And let me say, I'm really looking forward to flying the F-15. I hope that I will get to fly it as soon as it comes out. It sounds like it's just what the doctor ordered for a real fighter pilot. And as far as the Russians being ahead of us, wait until they see the performance of the F-15. I don't think we have to worry about anybody being ahead of us. From what I hear, and I don't want to give away any secrets, of course, I think that we'll not have to worry about anybody if we're flying the aircraft that the United States is making today.
How would you like to be in my shoes? You get two pilots together, and all I know about the planes, they all fly. I'll pause once more and remind our listeners our special guest today is Colonel Robinson Risner, a prisoner of war for the last 7.5 years. With me is news editor Jay Lewis.
I have one question. I'm wearing a Spiro Agnew wristwatch. Now that is a political development that's come about since you were captured.
Go back to sleep, Jay.
What do you think about the new politics of the country?
Well, I hadn't noticed your watch. Well, is this supposed to mean that he's running for president, or what? What is this? It's got flags all over the face of it and a picture of Mr. Agnew.
I think it's up to each individual voter's interpretation, mostly. Do you think that sort of thing is a good new way to look at politics? In other words, bringing it into the focus of every man, the ability to make fun of our leaders if they do something that's worthy of making fun of, or to look at them as humans more than anything else. Now, they were obviously some sort of demigods to the prisoners of war who were depending on them for their very survival and release. Do you think it's good that we can now sort of take them for granted and say, well, yes, look at the cute watch he makes and this sort of thing? Does that kind of turn you on to the American way?
Well, I think it's going to take a bit of getting used to. You know, I still hold the president in a great bit of reverence. After all, he is the chosen representative of all the people in the United States. Even though they all didn't vote for him, the majority did. And so he's ours. And he is the guy that makes the decisions. And so I'm still a little old-fashioned, really, at least about the people in the high offices. Even though I might not be for President Nixon, I am for him. But if I weren't, I think I would hesitate to ever poke fun at him. I cringe a little bit, I think, inside when I hear people do that, or they use terms that are maybe not as complimentary as I would use. I guess I haven't come up to speed, if that's what you want to call it, because I'm still old-fashioned enough to think of our president, our chief executive. He is also my commander-in-chief, and he holds a place of honor in my eyes. You mentioned your watch here, and I noticed it's got a lot of flags on the face of it. Let me say that something that thrills me every day are the flags that I see. And to me, you can't imagine how beautiful they are. I have a flag here in my house, and I hope never to be without another flag. You know, when you're denied seeing that flag, it brings you back to the place where we were once, perhaps, where we appreciated a great deal. It represents a whole lot of things. You know, I think we have covered ourselves for many years with a lot of sophistication that we might be as well off without. The United States flag is a great thing. It's a symbol to me. It does represent all those things that people say it should. The red for the blood of the brave, and the virtue, and all the other things that is embodied in the flag. It still means that to me. And if that's being old-fashioned, I hope that I don't change too much, because I like the lump in my throat when the flag passes. And I think I stand a little taller when the Star-Spangled Banner plays. You know, perhaps you could attribute this to the taste buds for freedom becoming more acute because we've had so little of it, to erode our taste buds for so many years. And I'm so acutely aware of freedom. The ability to enter and leave my own door when I want to catch an airliner and go to another city, to work where I want to hold a job, to get in or out of the service. You know, we talk about that sometimes, but I have a feeling we take so much for granted that really is something very great that so much of the world do not have. We saw this firsthand day by day where we were. So we're going to be appreciative of freedom for a long, long time. And I hope that we never lose this appreciation.
Colonel, I want you to know not everything has changed. Jay has a Spiro Agnew watch, but I still have Mickey Mouse, so everything isn't different. Let me ask you, I wanted to talk a little bit about the propaganda films. How did the Vietnamese go about selecting the people who would be in them? And once they had decided who they would have in them, how did they decide, or how did they persuade those people to be in them?
I really don't know the answer to the first part. I don't know how they selected them. I suspect they may have tried to get someone that was known, or some of the people may have been requested by name. In other words, a person's name might have been known by someone perchance. Or, and this is very factual, they chose people sometimes to punish them. If the guy was really down in their eyes, if he'd really been bucking them, in other words, wouldn't give them anything, and so forth, as they call them, incorrigible. When they call him incorrigible, that means thumbs up. Boy, he's number one, you know, because he's not giving them anything, and he doesn't intend to. And I trust most of them were like that. But they will grab a guy like this and say, okay, we're going to humiliate him, we're going to force him, and they just torture him. Or they subject him to so much fatigue and pain until his mind finally gives up. He says, oh, well, that's just not worth it. You know, I don't want to lose the use of my eyes or the use of my limbs or my mental faculties. So they finally just if they have done this, this is the way they do it.
Were you ever in a propaganda film of any kind at all?
I was never forced to do this.
Did they ever try to get you into one?
I don't recall if they did or not.
Oh, hi there, Jay. Let me ask you one thing. You have been very close, at least closer than most of us, to the president since you came back. You've talked to him on the phone at least once that I know of, and if we as newsmen are correct in our speculation, he referred to a meeting with you in his latest speech. Do you have any criticism at all about any way the president handled the war situation at all?
Well, again, let me say, I'm not a politician. And I haven't been on hand. But I will name 2 or 3 things that we are fiercely proud about and that we support the president in. You know, when he went into Cambodia, we just thought the house would fall in on him. And he did it. They made it stick. I'm talking about his support here at home, among Congress and so forth. And we weren't dead over there. We knew, you know, some of what must be taking place. And it took an awful lot of guts. And not only guts, but he was smart. In other words, he knew what he was doing, or it wouldn't have turned out like it did. He cut the VC off from a lot of their supplies. In fact, they were getting all their big supplies through there, I feel sure. Well, it did a lot. And then, when he mined the harbors, and when he bombed them with the B-52s, and when he came up with fighters and zapped them good after they shot down one of the recce planes. In other words, he grew in our eyes as he kept his word. You know, we would hear from the Vietnamese. He would make a speech, and we'd get a fragment of it. And we knew some of the things he said. He said, if you do this, I'll do this. And when they did, he did. And his word grew more credible with the Vietnamese, and therefore his ability to negotiate with them grew also. And I believed it when he said, sometime during his campaign for his last election, that he believed that he was now capable of negotiating with the Vietnamese more successfully than anyone else, because he had been dealing with them for 4 years, that they now understood him and he understood them. And there was a lot of reading between the lines there. I believe this is true. And I think they wanted him out of office worse than anything else, because they knew that they couldn't push him around and what he said he was going to do. And I think it turned out that way.
Do you think that the ordinary Vietnamese soldier knew what was going on in the world? Did he have a pretty undistorted view of what was happening?
Which Vietnamese, North or South?
Vietnamese.
No, the North Vietnamese know only what the state tells them. You know, one of their prime people, one of their most important people are their political commissars. This guy's more important than the field commander and probably takes precedence over him.
We mentioned early in the program about the reception that you got when you came back, not only you personally, but all of the prisoners. And yet we didn't really touch on the people who, for years and years, wore prisoner of war bracelets with your name on them, the people who comforted your wife and family. What do you have to say now to those people?
You know, if I could, if I were capable, and it were physically possible, I would love to meet every one of them and tell them how much it meant to get their letter or the bracelet or both. I'm going to try to answer every one of those letters, but it's going to take some time, and I hope people will be patient. But I have found a new kindness, or I think that I've seen something that I'd forgotten, the basic goodness of the people here, and actually a lot of love that you never think about. I just can't express my awe and humility in the face of all the kindness, genuine concern, and the sincere welcome I've received. I hope that I'll be able to write all of the people and tell them a little bit about myself and about my family, and I hope they will know that I appreciate so very much their kindness. Perhaps I could say just a word about myself and my family, and some of the people who have not written, they will know that I appreciate their thoughts and their prayers. I'm 48 years old, an Air Force career officer. I came into the service as an aviation cadet in 43, got out of the service in 46, and flew with the Air National Guard, came back into the service for Korea, and decided to become a career officer. And I've been in since that time. I was stationed in Panama, Korea, Spain, Germany, Hawaii, and Okinawa, Southeast Asia. I have 5 sons, the oldest which is 24, the youngest is 11, and I have a most wonderful wife in the world. She's brave and good, strong. I'm kind of prejudiced, of course. But she's done a wonderful job of keeping things together while I've been gone. I can never sing the praises of the wives high enough. Not just Kathleen, but all the wives that hung in there when the going was rough, had faith in their husband, faith in our government and our way of life. They never backed off when the chips were down. I just want to say, they are the ones that deserve recognition, and they are the ones that should get a medal.
What did you think when you were imprisoned about the wives? Surely that topic came up often. Did you wonder at all how they would make do with what they had? Did you have confidence that they would make it all right?
You know, something that relieved us greatly is knowing that our government, our services, were taking care of our families. And we knew this beyond any doubt, that they would keep the wives briefed, that the wives would have, they would be financially independent, they wouldn't go hungry, or, in other words, we knew that they were being taken care of, and this took a great load off our minds so that we could think about something else, more constructive. As far as the wives, of course, we know our wives individually. And we've talked about our wives so much that even now, people will call and ask for me, and if I'm not home, they'll say, okay, I'll talk to Kathleen. It's people she's never met, but they know her very well because I've talked about her. And all of those who have received pictures in their letters, they've shared them. Every time a picture would come in, it belonged to everyone. And he would have to explain, you know, the kids and who they were and what grade they were in and their personality and about their wives. And one guy said one day, boy, if my wife knew how much I've told my roommate, she'd divorce me.
Colonel Risner, we are out of time, but you've enlightened us more in this hour than we could ever thank you for or ever imagine. But I certainly do appreciate your joining us. Our special guest has been Colonel Robinson Risner, a prisoner of war for 7.5 years. For J. Lewis, this is Mike Williams speaking. The Risner Report, a presentation of the Oklahoma News Network. This program has been pre-recorded.